Greetings again. Part 3 of the 1873 Slave Trade Act. We got up to 22 last time, so starting with 23, returns by registrars. Again, this was repealed in 1998. The registrar of every British slave court, and, if appointed by Her Majesty, of every other slave court, shall from time to time make returns of the cases adjudged in such court in pursuance of this Act, at such times and in such form, and containing such particulars as may be from time to time directed by any rule established with respect to such court under the Vice Admiralty Courts Act 1863, or if there is no such rule, by order in council. So I do not understand precisely what is meant by returns here. Shall from time to time make returns of the cases adjudged, whether that's having the case heard again, but for the purpose in pursuance of the Act, the Slave Trade Act. Then it can be, it could be by order of council if it's not under a rule established by the Vice Admiralty Courts Act, 1863. Okay, now Section 24 has been partially repealed by the British government. I'll read the thing as it was in full, and then I'll read it with the repealed section out of it. 24. Incorporation with unrepealed portions of 5G4C 113. This Act shall be construed as one with the enactments of the Slave Trade Act 1824, and any enactments amending the same, so far as they are in force at the time of the passing of this Act, and are not repealed by this Act, and the expression "this Act," when used in this Act, shall include those enactments. And then with the repealed section taken out, this Act shall be construed as one with the enactments of the Slave Trade Act 1824, and the expression "this Act," when used in this Act, shall include those enactments. So the section repealed was, and any enactments amending the same, so far as they are in force at the time of the passing of this Act, and are not repealed by this Act. This Act shall be construed as one with the enactments of the Slave Trade Act 1824. This Act is a part of that Act. And then the section they removed, and any enactments amending the same so far as they are in force at the time of the passing of this Act, and are not repealed by this Act. So they are changing something quite significant here, I think, in that they're saying they're taking out the section that sort of put a time stamp on this and said, you can't change this. It's not going to be, amendments only if they were at the time of the passing of this Act. So they're changing that now, I think, so that they can still call it the same thing, but I think we'll find out that it's not the same thing. So 25, recovery of forfeitures under 5 George 4C 113, repealed in 1998. All pecuniary forfeitures and penalties imposed by the said enactments with which this Act is to be construed as one may be sued for, prosecuted, and recovered in any court of record or of Vice Admiralty, in any part of Her Majesty's dominions wherein the offence was committed, or where the offender may be, in like manner as any penalty or forfeiture incurred in the United Kingdom under any act for the time being in force relating to Her Majesty's customs, or in the case of the High Court of Admiralty or of a Court of Vice Admiralty, in like manner as any vessel seized in pursuance of this. So this just saying basically that Her Majesty can go after through the court suing, prosecuting in order to recover any penalties imposed by those who are involved in the slave trade. Such pecuniary penalties and forfeitures shall, subject to the express provisions of the said enactments, be paid and applied in like manner as the net proceeds of a vessel seized otherwise than by the commander or officer of one of Her Majesty's ships or of the cruiser of a foreign state. So this just saying that the penalties and other costs that the court deems will be enforced, will be recovered in the same manner as the way that they process a vessel that was involved in slave trade, then repurposed or broken up and sold on. Okay, Section 26, jurisdiction of court over offences under 5G4 C113. Now, a section of this was repealed in 98, another tiny section was repealed in 67, but that's very much a side note. I'll just read it in its entirety and then we'll look at what got omitted. Any offence against this Act or the said enactments with which this Act is to be construed as one, or otherwise in connection with the slave trade, shall for all purposes of and incidental to the trial and punishment of a person guilty of such offence, and all proceedings and matters preliminary and incidental to and consequential on such trial and punishment, and for all purposes of and incidental to the jurisdiction of any court, constable, and officer with reference to such offence, be deemed to have been committed either in the place in which the offence was committed, or in the county of Middlesex, or in any place in which the person guilty of the offence may for the time being be, either in Her Majesty's dominions, or in any foreign port or place in which Her Majesty has jurisdiction, and the offence may be described in any indictment or other document relating thereto as having been committed at the place where it was wholly or partly committed, or as having been committed on the high seas or out of Her Majesty's dominions, and the venue or local description in the margin may be that of the place in which the trial is held. So I think that's just establishing that the court will have jurisdiction, and it could be in a few different places, because the act of taking captive slaves and then transporting them across the seas, you can't get away from trial because you say, oh, it didn't happen here, because in reality it happened in multiple places. So any of the places where it happened is as good as any other for the purposes of prosecution. where any such offence is commenced at one place and completed at another, the place at which such offence is to be deemed to have been committed shall be either the place where the offence was commenced or the place where the offence was completed. So that just goes into what I was saying. They can prosecute you on either end, the pick up, the drop off. Where a person being in one place is accessory to or aids or abets in any such offence committed in another place, the place at which such offence is to be deemed to have been committed shall be either the place in which the offence was actually committed or the place where the offender was at the time of his being so accessory, aiding or abetting. So again, just saying, you can't wriggle out of this by saying, oh, well, it happened in that country. It happened in that place. It can be either. So, yeah, a strong stance being taken by this act to empower those trying to suppress the slave trade, incentivising the seizures. Now, this last section has all been repealed. Where it appears to any court or the judge of any court having jurisdiction to try any such offence, that the removal of an offender charged with such offence to some other place in Her Majesty's dominions for trial would be conducive to the interests of justice. Such court or judge may, by warrant or instrument in the nature of a warrant, direct such removal, and such offender may be removed and tried accordingly. And Section 268 of the Merchant Shipping Act 1854 shall apply to the removal of an offender under this section in the same manner as if the term consular officer in that section included the court or judge making such warrant or instrument. So this seems to be another interesting repeal. To me, that reads as though if the judge of any court having jurisdiction to a Slave Trade Act offence determines, the judges, that it would be conducive to the interests of justice to remove, to place an offender from one place to be tried somewhere else, then they are free to do so. So I'll let your imagination think about what that might entail. So before I move on to 27, just going back to the start or the first paragraph of 26, the section, or in the county of Middlesex, that was repealed in 67. So I'm guessing that was something to do with a change in county lines or something like that. And then they've just removed a short section, either in Her Majesty's dominions or in any foreign port or place in which Her Majesty has jurisdiction. So another loophole created, I think, by that repeal. So moving on to 27, extension of 33 and 34, Victoria, circa 52, to slave trade offences. This was repealed by Extradition Act in 1989. So it's a bit of a theme developing here, as if some folks maybe knew what was going to come, were trying to protect themselves in Britain. Offences committed against this Act or the enactments with which this Act is to be construed as one or otherwise in connection with the slave trade whether committed on the high seas or on land, or partly on the high seas or partly on land, shall be deemed to be inserted in the first schedule to the Extradition Act, 1870, and that Act, and any Act amending the same, shall be construed accordingly. So to get to the bottom of that one would probably require looking at the Extradition Act 1870, which I won't do now. But it would seem that the repeal in that case in 89 looks like more of the same. Subverting justice and subverting the suppression of the slave trade, of the purposes this act was put forward for in the first place. 28, repealed 98, application of act to cases already adjudicated. This act shall apply to all cases of vessels, slaves, goods, and effects seized and adjudicated upon by any slave court, whether before or after the passing of this act. Well, isn't that a nifty thing to repeal from the act? This act shall apply to all cases, vessels, slaves, etc., by any slave court, whether before or after the passing of this act. So he's been kneecapped in 98 by British government, meaning they well, I'll find out once again. I'll have to look into 1998 to find out precisely what it morphed into. Section 29, Clause 29, extension of Act to future treaties, again, repealed in 1998, where any treaty in relation to the slave trade is made after the passing of this Act by or on behalf of Her Majesty with any foreign state, Her Majesty may by order in council direct that as from such date, not being earlier than the date of the treaty, as may be specified in the order. Such treaty shall be deemed, and thereupon, as from the said date, or if no date is specified as from the date of such order, such treaty shall be deemed to be an existing slave trade treaty within the meaning of this Act, and all the provisions of this Act shall apply and be construed accordingly. So that, to me, just allowing for future treaties to come into this one, or being incorporated by this one, obviously not before the date of the treaty itself. Her Majesty may, by the same or any subsequent order referring to the same treaty, render the application of this Act subject to such conditions, exceptions, and qualifications as may be deemed expedient. So that, to me, just reads like Her Majesty may be able to tweak certain conditions, exceptions, qualifications to treaties in order to fulfill the purposes of this Act, in pursuance of this Act. Every such order shall recite or embody the terms of the treaty so far as they relate to the slave trade, and shall be laid before both Houses of Parliament within 6 weeks after it is made, or if Parliament be not then sitting, within 6 weeks after the then next meeting of Parliament, and shall also be published in the London Gazette. So that's just notification. the process, the timeline. A treaty, whether made before or after the passing of this Act, which ceases to be in force, shall cease to be an existing slave trade treaty within the meaning of this Act. So that whole section has been repealed. So if a treaty, whether made before or after, ceases to be in force, it shall cease to be an existing slave trade treaty within the meaning of this Act. So another treaty that has been cancelled, then it can't be in pursuance of the Slave Trade Act. It's not incorporated by this slave trade treaty. So repeal. 30. And I'm sensing a bit of a question here, which hopefully will become clear to me as we go. Repeal. 30. Repeal of acts in schedule. The acts specified in the second schedule to this Act are hereby repealed, provided that 1. All bounties and other sums purporting to have been paid in pursuance of any enactment hereby repealed before the passing of this Act shall be deemed to have been duly paid. So I can't tell me what you see. I couldn't tell if 30, section 1, was repealed. As we go to as it sits currently, let me get down to 30. We see blank. Section 30, Schedule 2, repealed by Statute Law Revision Act 1883. But Section 30 1 is not here, and it is not stated to have been repealed. Unless I am misreading this and Section 30, Schedule 2. Now, I don't know what Schedule 2, because at the end, after this clause 30, there's a first schedule and a second schedule. But this here says Section 30, Schedule 2, repealed, which I can only take to mean that they've repealed clause or subclause 2 of clause 30. But they haven't specifically repealed subclause 1 of Section 30. Yeah, and when we get down here, this is the first and second schedule that I was referring to. So to me, this seems like a bit of hijinks to me. I have been known to be conspiracy-minded. So let's go back to the original. So this is not where it's not clear whether it's repealed or not. All bounties and other sums purporting to have been paid in pursuance of any enactment hereby repealed before the passing of this Act shall be deemed to have been duly paid. Yeah, that's just saying that they're wiping the slate clean as far as I can see. For any bounties to have been paid in pursuance of any enactment that has been repealed. before the passing of this act. 2. This repeal shall not affect anything duly done or suffered under any enactment hereby repealed. B. Any right, privilege, obligation, liability, or forfeiture acquired, accrued, or incurred under any enactment hereby repealed. C. Any investigation, legal proceeding, or remedy in respect of any such right, privilege, obligation, liability, or forfeiture as aforesaid, or any legal proceeding taken or commenced under any enactment hereby repealed. And any such investigation, legal proceeding, and remedy may be carried on, and all acts consequential thereon done as if it had been commenced under this act. So I don't know if I'm having a brain fart or if this is actually as complicated as it seems. Back to the top. Repeal of acts in schedule. The acts specified in the second schedule to this act, which comes later, those acts specified in that schedule are hereby repealed, provided that, on condition, they're repealed conditionally, that 1. All bounties and other sums purporting to have been paid in pursuance of any enactment hereby repealed before the passing of this act shall be deemed to have been duly paid. Or 2, the acts specified in the second schedule to this act are hereby repealed, provided that 2, this repeal shall not affect. So, the acts in the schedule 2 that's to come are hereby repealed, provided that the repeal shall not affect anything duly done or suffered under any enactment hereby repealed. Or B, any right, privilege, obligation, liability, or forfeiture acquired, accrued, or incurred under any enactment hereby repealed. Or any investigation, legal proceeding, or remedy in respect of any such right, privilege, obligation, liability, or forfeiture as aforesaid, or any legal proceeding taken or commenced under any enactment hereby repealed. And any such investigation, legal proceeding, and remedy may be carried on, and all acts consequential thereon done, as if it had been commenced under this act. Okay, I'm going to move on, even though I remain unclear here, because this section 2, I think it's just my brain's breaking with this. Section 2 is dealing with repeal, provided that the repeal won't affect more repeals, but this section itself was repealed by the Statute Law Revision Act of 1883, which also removed the second schedule that we'll get to of the acts repealed. So I think I'm going in circles. Okay, so I'll finish with, I won't look at the second schedule then because that just takes us to a whole bunch of different acts, and I think that's getting into the weeds. So the first schedule, which was repealed in 1998, equipments which are prima facie evidence of a vessel being engaged in the slave trade. First, hatches with open gratings instead of the closed hatches which are usual in merchant vessels. Slaves need air. Secondly, divisions or bulkheads in the hold or on deck more numerous than are necessary for vessels engaged in lawful trade. What are you hiding in those divisions of bulkheads? Thirdly, spare plank fitted for being laid down as a second or slave deck. Fourthly, shackles, bolts, or handcuffs. That's pretty clear. Fifthly, a large quantity of water in casks or in tanks than is requisite for the consumption of the crew of the vessel as a merchant vessel. So, slaves need water. Sixthly, an extraordinary number of water casks or of other vessels for holding liquid, unless the master shall produce a certificate from the custom house at the place from which he cleared outwards, stating that a sufficient security had been given by the owners of such vessel that such extra quantity of casks or of other vessels should only be used for the reception of palm oil or for other purposes of lawful commerce. So if you've got an unusually large number of water casks or for vessels for holding liquid, you need certification that that's a part of lawful commerce. For example, some people may in fact be transporting vessels or casks themselves. Seventhly, a greater quantity of mess tubs or kids than are requisite for the use of the crew of the vessel as a merchant vessel. My ignorance, mess tubs, and I'm not sure what's meant by kids, but I feel from context it's more of the same. Eighthly, a boiler or other cooking apparatus of an unusual size and larger or fitted for being or capable of being made larger than requisite for the use of the crew of the vessel as a merchant vessel, or more than one boiler or other cooking apparatus of the ordinary size. So that's for the instance where you've got several boilers when there's only a crew of 20 and one boiler would easily do it. Why are you carrying? You don't carry extra anything when you're making a voyage at sea. You carry only what you need. So that is another example of equipments which are prima facie evidence of a vessel being engaged in the slave trade. Ninthly, an extraordinary quantity either of rice or of the flour of Brazil, manioc or cassata, commonly called farina, of maize or of Indian corn, or of any other article of food whatever beyond what might probably be requisite for the use of the crew, such rice, flour, maize, Indian corn, or other article of food not being entered on the manifest as part of the cargo for trade. So yes, once again, some vessels may be carrying additional. They may actually be involved in the trade of flour, corn, etc. But if they're not explicitly doing that, why you explain your extra food supplies? What's below deck? 10thly, a quantity of mats or matting larger than is necessary for the use of the crew of the vessel as a merchant vessel. How come you got 10 in your crew and then there's 40 beds here? 11thly, any other equipment, article, or thing which is declared by any existing slave trade treaty to be a prima facie evidence of a vessel being engaged in the slave trade. So I guess this will all make more sense once we look at what happened in 1998. But all of that's been repealed. Why would you repeal such a schedule? These are all obviously obviously prima facie evidence of a vessel being engaged in the slave trade. So, I'll see you again shortly.